Finally, we've had some real action in the 2019 Formula One season. Cards on the table, qualifying for the Australian Grand Prix took place here at Albert Park just a few hours ago. And it was a remarkable session. Mercedes finishing first and second, not a massive surprise in recent history in Formula One, a bit of a surprise given the testing form, but the margin of their advantage was remarkable. Sebastian Vettel for Ferrari, the next best in third place, 0.704 seconds behind. That's a huge margin. I'm joined by Scott Mitchell to talk through some of the big stories of the day. And we have to start, Scott, don't we, with the pace of Mercedes, which surprised us, it surprised rival teams, it surprised those inside Mercedes as well.
How bonkers is it that a sixth consecutive pole position, I think, for Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes at Albert Park can be considered a surprise, but it is to everybody. Valtteri Bottas blown away, Lewis Hamilton a real shock. Toto Wolff didn't trust Friday practice. So Mercedes, they genuinely believed after testing that they were behind Ferrari, like everybody. They fell for the phony war of testing. They thought they were not nowhere near, but they thought they had a real deficit to make up. They were encouraged by their pace on Friday, thought that maybe they were a bit closer, but they still expected Ferrari to be ahead or at least be level. So to be 7/10 in the clear, something that Mercedes certainly weren't expecting. They don't seem to really have an answer for it. Lewis Hamilton says that they haven't brought any upgrades here, certainly nothing meaningful changed on the car. So it just seems to be sort of greater understanding. We know that this track historically suits Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton as well. But the fact that Bottas was there on provisional pole after the first runs, only a tenth behind Lewis at the end, shows that it wasn't a Lewis Bonza lap or anything like that. Real pace in the Mercedes, and certainly something that Ferrari couldn't live with today.
Well, it's really fantastic to have been surprised by this session. I was grinning all the way through it. I remember at one stage saying to you, this is brilliant because this is what you want from sport. You want that unpredictability. There was nothing in testing to suggest this was the form. Absolutely nothing. I mean, we can look back and say, well, the testing analysis was wrong, but we looked at the numbers, crunched them, so did the teams. We had a certain picture. So it's just great that Formula One can surprise us this way.
Well, I'm sure a lot of people probably think that we've got egg on our face right now because I thought Ferrari was quickest. I said Ferrari was quickest. You thought and said Ferrari was quickest. But everyone did that. We all got caught out. It's a bit of a oversimplification to say that we all just got hoodwinked by testing. It could prove to be an anomaly.
Well, there's an interesting point. Here last year, Lewis was on pole from Ferrari by a similar margin, got the tyres really working, and in the next three races, I think, Ferrari was on pole. So we have to have a little asterisk in that Albert Park is not the most representative circuit. But that said, we do have to say, Mercedes hands down beat Ferrari today.
But as Mercedes team principal Toto Wolff told us just now, I asked him if there's any reason for them to sort of now expect this. Does this become the norm? Will they be disappointed if they go back to a normal sized advantage or are behind Ferrari? And he said there's absolutely no reason for them to expect to be 7/10 up the road at every other race. I'm struggling to say that with a straight face. 7/10 of a second, it's amazing. But you were fairly confident after Friday practice, like I was, and like I think everybody was, that Ferrari were holding something back. So how surprised were you that they didn't then come out the blocks faster today?
Certainly, I wouldn't have been completely surprised if it was a gap of a couple of tenths. The gap in FP3 was 2.5 tenths from Hamilton to Vettel, and I thought that little bit of a surprise, but only a small one. But the margin, I had no idea it was going to be that size. Ferrari was very slightly closer to Mercedes today than it was yesterday, but we're talking a tenth and a bit, so that's not really particularly significant in the grand scheme of things. So surprise.
I mean, one of the things for me that's more significant is the fact that Ferrari were so far off Mercedes that they got split by the Red Bull with Max Verstappen, and we can look at that and say, that's just because Ferrari was really far back. But actually, Toto Wolff said that the Hondas made a big difference in the back of that Red Bull. He described the Red Bull as a different car, effectively, in qualifying trim. We know that with Renault, Red Bull really struggled to, when everyone turned it up to 11, that's when Red Bull fell back. But Verstappen seemed to split the Ferraris on merit. I know Charles Leclerc, he said earlier today that he wasn't very happy, he didn't do a very good job with his lap. But would it be a fair assumption, do you think, to say that actually the competitive order is sort of roughly where we thought everyone would be? It's just maybe Ferrari maybe a little bit off where we thought they'd be, but just Mercedes are the ones that have made that leap. Everything else suggests that it's sort of where we thought it was, right? Even including the midfield battle. Yeah,
exactly. Well, I've got my timing sheet here just to have a look at it. We've got Max Verstappen did a 1:21.320 compared to Hamilton's 1:24.86, and Sebastian Vettel did a 21.190. So Red Bull less than 2 tenths behind, a tenth and a bit off. So it does feel a little bit like, yeah, Mercedes has shifted forward, and of course they bought this major upgrade package to the second test. They've clearly done a lot of work on that, understanding it, how to get the best out of it in the intervening time. So I guess we just have to say, yeah, Mercedes has absolutely nailed it. And I don't, this whole thing about sandbagging, yeah, teams don't go out to set qualifying laps in testing, but there is sort of a pattern of performance there, and that's what Mercedes was looking at. And all the other teams were looking at when they made their kind of predictions of where things were in Barcelona a couple of weeks ago. Of course, on a very different circuit. So I think what we've seen is gains from Mercedes. Ferrari maybe having a little bit of a tricky weekend. They were struggling a bit with rear stability, that kind of thing. That never seemed to come. I kind of thought they'd make a big step from Friday to Saturday like they often do. That didn't seem to be the case. So Red Bull kind of not too far off Ferrari, which we sort of thought, because we thought Red Bull could be in the vicinity of Mercedes.
Maybe, yeah, but I think what was interesting for me was they asked, they're not in that no man's land because Ferrari are back there with them. But at the same time, they're not a million miles clear of the lead. Well, I was going to say lead of the midfield teams, but that sort of that compressed gap that we saw, I think, was it in Q1 we had all the top 18. We've got to disregard the Williams, sadly, because their poor Friday form continued and they were nowhere again in qualifying. But we had 18 cars covered by a second in Q1. But that midfield battle, that has sort of gone to form, would you say?
Give or take. Well, I'll get the trusty iPad out. Haas dominated it, first and second in class. Romain Grosjean, 6th. Kevin Magnussen, 7th. Now, they were almost half a second ahead of this clutch of midfield teams. And those other 5 midfield teams, if you take the fastest lap by each car, were covered by 0.332. Great performance from McLaren. Lando Norris on debut, 8th. Surprised to see a racing point, that of Sergio Perez in Q3. But I do think there's kind of that gap between Haas and where McLaren was. There's a space there for Renault had they not had problems to slip in.
Yes.
Possibly Toro Rosso that had some good pace and could have been in Q3. They're very close with Alex Albon, actually. He's only a tenth and a bit off getting through out of Q2. So, yeah, I think that's a little bit closer to what we expected, certainly with Haas at the front and a very, very tight group in the rest of the midfield.
I remember when we got into some of the pre-season testing analysis, there was certainly plenty of people suggesting that maybe we'd not given McLaren a sort of fair crack and maybe not sort of given them the credit they deserved in testing. But by their own admission, similar to Mercedes sort of suddenly having this massive gap, by McLaren's own admission, they did not anticipate having a car in Q3 today.
No, absolutely. I heard from the drivers earlier in the scene, they were sort of trying to downplay expectations. I think what we saw today from McLaren, and McLaren even last year when they were struggling with the car in terms of its performance and the aero and that kind of thing, as a race team, trackside, operationally, I've said this quite a few times, they were running pretty well. They were getting some pretty good results given the pace for big parts of the season. I think what we saw today was a team that kind of went into qualifying thinking, let's make sure we get out of Q1. Of course, Carlos Sainz didn't. He said that he was in the wrong place when Robert Kubica had his puncture after a brush with the wall towards the end of Q1. So Carlos Sainz fell. But Lando Norris, I think, just did a really good job, chased the track evolution, nailed it when he needed to. Great job in Q2, great job in Q3. So I think what we saw there is a car that's sort of not the strongest in the midfield, but a very, very well executed qualifying session. They're not going to get carried away with it, but all respect to them, a great effort, and at least shows conclusively they are in that group to fight.
I think the 2 examples that you gave of those Q3 not contenders, people that actually made it into Q3 and did a very good job, Sergio Perez and Lando Norris, McLaren and Racing Point weren't in that mix, but what we heard from Daniel Ricciardo yesterday, I remember Jonathan Noble came back and told us that Ricciardo was talking about 2 tenths of a second, and that could be 2 rows on the grid, 4 places. And I think Norris for McLaren absolutely nailed it when it mattered in Q1 and then did the business in Q2 as well. Perez did the same. You look at the fact that both of their respective teammates got knocked out of Q1, so it just shows that the driver can really make the difference. And that's what I love to see, that midfield battle. Obviously we want to see that like all through the grid, but I think it's really impressive that midfield battle allows the different teams to do different things, have different concepts, create something out of so many hundreds, thousands of parts and lap around this Albert Park circuit within a few hundredths and tenths of each other, and the drivers also get to make a difference as well. The thing that makes me really sad, and I believe you've got insight from when you went and spoke to George Russell and Robert Kubica this evening, is that you could give Williams 2 tenths, half a second and it wouldn't make a difference to their qualifying position, which is astonishing.
Well, timing sheets, they don't lie, do they? And looking at it, George Russell did a 1:24.360. The next quickest, or the next slowest, you should almost say, was Carlos Sainz at 1:23.084, so 1.3 seconds off the back of the midfield pack. That's kind of in line with where we thought they might get to. Yesterday was pretty bad. Today, fractionally better maybe, but yeah, the car's just not there. And in fact, Kubica was an interesting case. He had to rely on his Q1 first run for his qualifying position because he did have that moment with the wall, and he said actually on the second set of tyres in Q1 the car actually really started to come alive for him and he had more grip, but he just made a misjudgment in terms of the placing of the car. He said it was a silly mistake. He was classic Robert Kubica of old. He was giving himself a far harder time than any of us could for that mistake. He said it was silly and put his hands up, and that kind of caught him out. And then the right rear puncture when he got on the approach to turn 11, 12, the fast sweeper. But yeah, Williams, it's just 100% confirmation they're on for a long, hard season. They're treating the first part of the season as a test, an extended test session, and those two drivers, the whole team's just got to get their head down, accept it's going to be a long, long time before they can really be racing anyone, and just do what they can with what they've got. And that's the message George Russell keeps saying. He's just got to work with his race engineer and his performance engineer to do what he can with the car, and he thought they did pretty much what they could do with the car they had under them today.
Yeah, he said that he can leave today with his head held high. He can be proud of his performance. He also said bracing himself for a long race tomorrow. Basically, it's a race of getting to the end, no silly mistakes, bank as much data as you can from the race as possible. So I'm not expecting to see much in the way of progress for Williams at the back of the grid. The one thing I am optimistic for is that we'll maybe see a little bit more at the front. Mercedes' advantage over one lap is obviously real. That has now been borne out. We were told qualifying, that's where you make your judgments. Well, Mercedes are well in the clear. They did have a long run pace on Friday, didn't they? But
it was the long run pace advantage was very similar.
Yeah, exactly. So, but what I would say is that Mercedes is braced for Ferrari to come back at them. We know that Red Bull, Honda, it's not a complete world apart from what life with Renault was like. They're going to be closer in race trim on the engine side than they are over one lap. So let's hope that we can have Vettel, Verstappen, maybe Leclerc as well, just come into that fight a little bit more. Would hate to see a 7/10 advantage replicated come race day.
Well, I think it's going to be a fantastic race here tomorrow. We've had some surprises today. We've got a really congested midfield. We've got the question of can Ferrari be closer in race trim? How will that battle with Max Verstappen's Red Bull shake out? And of course, we should say Pierre Gasly out in Q1 after he only did one run. A bit of an error there not to send him out for a second attempt. For whatever reason they decided to do that, so just one Red Bull up there. And then we've got this midfield battle. Perhaps that grid is a little bit out of order in that place. The Haas is at the front, that's right, but we'll see some maybe slightly quicker cars trying to come through. Lando Norris on debut after a great qualifying performance. Can he hold on to a top 10 position and score on debut? Alexander Albon, we should say, outqualified Daniel Kvyat. Did very well in 13th place, not too far off a Q3 place. So we've got all these storylines. I guess we should say at the back it's how many times will Williams be lapped, but yeah, they're going to be incidental in the race. But it's a great setup, and I think the fantastic thing is that Formula One, it's a sport, it showed it can surprise us, and the Mercedes 1-2 might not sound like a surprise, but given what we've seen so far, it is, and it's laid the foundations for what should be a fascinating race and a season to come.